The morning air was cold that day in Vienna. It was October 1987 and the leaves were turning golden brown. Inside the Grand Vienna Conservatory, something special was about to happen. But nobody knew it yet. A small figure stood at the massive wooden doors of the audition hall. His name was Thomas Werner, and he was just 12 years old. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from pure fear. He had never seen a building this beautiful in his entire life. Thomas came from a tiny village called Eisenberg, tucked away in the Austrian mountains. His father worked in the coal mines, just like his grandfather had done before him. Their home was simple, 3 small rooms for 5 people, but it was filled with love and music. Now, standing before these enormous doors, Thomas felt completely out of place. His jacket was too small for him. His mother had tried her best to make it look presentable, sewing patches on the elbows where the fabric had worn through. His shoes were his older brother's, stuffed with newspaper at the toes to make them fit. They made a slight squeaking sound when he walked. Through the gaps in the door he could hear other children warming up their instruments. Every sound was perfect. Every note was clean and precise. Thomas clutched his violin case tighter. It was old and battered, held together with strips of cloth tape that had turned yellow with age. He thought about leaving, just turning around and walking back to the train station. His mother had saved for months to afford his train ticket to Vienna. She had packed him sandwiches wrapped in brown paper and kissed his forehead that morning, telling him she believed in him. But belief felt like such a fragile thing right now. A well-dressed woman with a clipboard appeared at the door. She looked down at Thomas with surprise, as if she had not expected to find someone like him there. Her eyes moved from his worn jacket to his taped violin case, and something flickered across her face. Pity, maybe. Or doubt. "Name?" she asked, her pen hovering over her paper. "Thomas Werner, ma'am," he said quietly. She scanned her list, her finger moving down the page slowly. Too slowly. For a moment, Thomas wondered if his name was even there. Maybe this was all a mistake. Maybe the letter inviting him to audition had been sent to the wrong address. "Ah, here you are," she said finally. "You may wait inside. Your turn will be called." Thomas stepped through the doors and into another world. The audition hall was more beautiful than anything he had ever imagined. The ceiling stretched up so high that it made him dizzy to look at it. Crystal chandeliers hung from above, catching the morning light and scattering it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. The walls were covered in dark wood panels that seemed to glow with warmth, but it was the other children that made his stomach twist into knots. There were about 20 of them, all waiting their turn. They sat on velvet chairs along the walls, and every single one of them looked like they belonged there. The girls wore neat dresses with white collars. The boys had proper suits with straight ties. Their instrument cases were polished leather, with shiny brass locks that clicked open smoothly. Thomas found an empty chair near the back and sat down carefully, trying to make himself invisible. He placed his violin case on his lap and wrapped his arms around it protectively. A boy sitting nearby glanced at him. He was about Thomas's age, maybe a year older, with neat blonde hair and a violin case that probably cost more than everything Thomas's family owned combined. "First time in Vienna?" the boy asked. His tone was not exactly mean, but not exactly friendly either. "Yes," Thomas admitted. "Where are you from?" "Eisenberg. It's a small village. You probably have not heard of it." The boy nodded, confirming what Thomas already knew. Then he turned away and began checking his sheet music, straightened each page with careful precision. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to calm his racing heart. He thought about his grandfather, Otto, the old man who had taught him everything he knew about music. Otto had been a violinist once, a good one, performing with regional orchestras across Austria. But that was before the accident. Thomas still remembered the day his grandfather told him the story. They had been sitting in the barn behind the house, the place where they practiced every evening. Otto had held up his left hand, showing Thomas the 3 missing fingers that had been taken by a mining machine 30 years ago. "Music was my whole life," Otto had said, his voice heavy with old grief. When I lost these fingers, I thought I lost everything. I put my violin away and tried to forget it ever existed. But then Thomas, at age 6, had found that violin in the attic, dusty and forgotten, with 2 broken strings. He had carried it down to show his grandfather, not understanding why the old man's eyes had filled with tears. From that day forward, Otto had taught him. Not in a fancy school with proper teachers, not with new sheet music or expensive lessons. Just the 2 of them, in a barn that smelled of hay and old wood, practicing until Thomas's fingers bled and then practicing some more. "You have a gift," Otto would tell him. "A real gift. Promise me you will not waste it like I did. Promise me you will share it with the world." Thomas had promised. And 3 months ago, Otto had passed away quietly in his sleep. At the funeral, Thomas's mother had found a letter in Otto's coat pocket. It was an application to the Vienna Conservatory's annual youth talent search, already filled out and addressed. All it needed was a stamp. "He believed in you," she had said, pressing the letter into Thomas's hands. "We need to send this." Now, sitting in this grand hall surrounded by children who seemed to breathe music as naturally as air, Thomas wondered if his grandfather's belief had been misplaced. These children had everything. Training, money, connections, confidence. What did he have? Just a battered violin and hours of practice in a barn. A door at the front of the hall opened, and 3 people walked in. 2 of them wore formal black clothing and carried notebooks. But it was the 3rd person who made everyone sit up straighter. Even Thomas, who knew nothing about the classical music world, recognized the way this man commanded attention. He was older, maybe in his late 70s, with silver hair swept back from a strong face. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his entire life doing exactly what he was meant to do. The man took a seat at the center of the judging panel, and Thomas heard the blond boy beside him whisper to his neighbor, "That's Heinrich von Karajan, the Heinrich von Karajan. He conducts the Berlin Philharmonic." Thomas's hands went cold. He had heard that name before. His grandfather had recordings of this man's concerts, worn records that Otto would play on special occasions, closing his eyes and conducting along with invisible movements of his hands. This was real now, terrifyingly real. In a few minutes, Thomas would stand before one of the greatest musicians in the world, with a broken violin and a dream that suddenly felt impossibly small. The woman with the clipboard stood up and called the first name. A girl with perfect posture walked to the center of the hall, carrying her violin with practiced grace. She played beautifully, her fingers dancing across the strings without a single mistake. When she finished, the judges clapped politely and made notes in their books. The maestro nodded once, his face revealing nothing. One by one, the children were called. One by one, they performed pieces that sounded like perfection to Thomas's ears. And one by one, his confidence crumbled a little more. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 90 minutes, the woman looked at her clipboard and called out, "Thomas Werner." He stood up. His legs felt weak, like they might not carry him. The blond boy gave him a look that might have been encouragement or might have been pity. Thomas could not tell which would be worse. He walked toward the center of the hall, his borrowed shoes squeaking slightly with each step. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, announcing his nervousness to everyone present. When he reached the spot where all the others had stood, he turned to face the judges. The maestro looked at him for a long moment. Those sharp eyes took in everything. The too small jacket, the worn shoes, the violin case held together with tape. Then the old man's gaze met Thomas's, and something passed between them. Not judgment exactly, but a question. A challenge, perhaps. The maestro raised one hand slightly, a gesture that said, "Show me what you have brought here today." Thomas's fingers fumbled with the clasps on his violin case. They were old metal clips, the kind that stuck sometimes. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, watching, waiting. The silence in the hall was so complete that he could hear his own breathing. Finally, the clasps gave way. He opened the case slowly, and there it was. His grandfather's violin. The wood was scratched in places, worn smooth in others from decades of being held and played. One of the strings was slightly discolored, because they had replaced it last year with the only one they could afford. The bow hair was thinning in spots, but his mother had helped him apply rosin to it that morning, rubbing it carefully until it would grip the strings. Thomas lifted the violin out of the case with both hands, the way his grandfather had taught him. "Like you are holding something precious," Otto used to say. "Because it is." He heard a small sound from the judging table. Not quite a laugh, but something close. One of the judges, the younger man in the black suit, had raised his eyebrows. The judge. He leaned over and whispered something to his colleague. Thomas could not hear the words, but he could guess their meaning. "Look at that instrument. Look at this boy. What is he doing here?" Only the maestro remained still, his face unreadable. Those sharp eyes watched Thomas with an intensity that made the boy's stomach tighten even more. Thomas took a breath and positioned the violin under his chin. The familiar weight of it settled against his collarbone, the chin rest cool against his skin. For a moment, despite his fear, he felt something else. A connection. This violin had been his grandfather's voice once. Now it would be his. "What will you play for us today?" the maestro asked. His voice was deep and carried easily across the hall, despite being barely louder than a normal speaking voice. "Caprice number 24. By Paganini, sir," Thomas said. His voice came out smaller than he intended, almost a whisper. The silence that followed was different now. Thomas heard one of the judges make a sharp intake of breath. The blond boy who had been sitting next to him earlier made a small choking sound. Even the woman with the clipboard looked up from her papers, surprise clear on her face. The maestro leaned back in his chair slightly. For the first time, something like interest flickered across his features. Or maybe it was amusement. Thomas could not tell which. "That is quite an ambitious choice," the maestro said carefully. "Do you understand what you are attempting?" Thomas nodded. He understood perfectly. Paganini's Caprice number 24 was considered one of the most technically difficult pieces ever written for solo violin. Professional musicians spent years mastering it. Some never did. It required speed, precision, perfect intonation, and dozens of advanced techniques that most young violinists had not even learned yet. His grandfather had introduced him to the piece 2 years ago. Otto had played a recording, and Thomas had listened with his eyes closed, feeling the music move through him like electricity. When it ended, he had looked at his grandfather and said simply, "I want to learn that." Otto had laughed at first, thinking it was a child's impossible dream. But Thomas had been serious, deadly serious, and over the next 2 years, section by section, measure by measure, his grandfather had taught him. They had worked on it almost every single evening in that barn, Otto guiding him through the most difficult passages with infinite patience. "You will fall down 100 times before you get this right," Otto had told him, maybe 1,000 times. "But each time you fall, you learn something. That is how we grow." Now, standing in this grand hall with everyone staring at him, Thomas wondered if he had been foolish. Maybe he should have chosen something easier, something more appropriate for a 12-year-old boy from a mining village. But it was too late now. He had made his choice, and his grandfather had always taught him to commit fully to every decision. "I understand, sir," Thomas said to the maestro. "I would still like to try." The old conductor nodded once. "Then please begin." Thomas raised the bow. His hand was shaking. He could see it trembling there in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either come together or fall apart completely. He touched the bow to the strings and drew the first note. It came out thin and wavering, more of a squeak than a proper sound. Someone in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. This was going wrong already, right from the very first note. He was failing. But then he heard his grandfather's voice in his head, as clear as if Otto was standing right beside him. "Do not think about them, boy. Do not think about the hall or the judges or anything else. Think only about the music. Let everything else fall away." Thomas closed his eyes and played the second note. Then the third, and somewhere around the fourth or fifth note, something shifted inside him. The trembling in his hand began to steady. His breathing found its rhythm. The fear did not go away entirely, but it moved to the edges of his awareness, like something watching from a distance instead of something crushing him from the inside. He stopped being Thomas Werner, the scared boy in borrowed shoes. He became something else, a channel for the music, a voice for his grandfather's dreams. His fingers began to move faster across the fingerboard, dancing through the opening runs of the caprice. The piece started simply enough, but Paganini had built it like a trap. It lured you in with a deceptively straightforward melody, then suddenly exploded into cascades of notes that seemed impossible to play. Thomas navigated the first variation, his bow moving with increasing confidence. The old violin responded beneath his fingers, its voice warming up as he played. Yes, it was scratched. Yes, it had mismatched strings. But it had been played with love for decades, and somehow that love had soaked into the wood itself. He moved into the second variation, where the notes came faster and required quick position changes. His left hand flew up and down the neck of the violin, finding each note with muscle memory built from countless hours of practice. Up in the barn, he had played this section so many times that his fingers had bled. His mother had bandaged them, and the next evening he had played it again. In the hall, something was changing. Thomas could not see it with his eyes closed, but he could feel it. The quality of the silence had shifted. It was no longer the silence of polite waiting or skeptical judgment. It had become something else, the silence of genuine attention. The third variation introduced rapid string crossings where the bow had to jump cleanly between strings at incredible speed. This was where many violinists stumbled, producing scratchy or uneven sounds. But Thomas had practiced this section until his arm ached, until the movement became as natural as breathing. His bow danced across the strings and the notes rang out clear and true. He opened his eyes briefly as he played, not to look at the judges but to see his fingers on the strings. His grandfather used to tell him that watching your hands could help center your focus. And Otto had been right. Seeing his own fingers moving through the patterns that his grandfather had taught him made everything feel real and solid. The fourth variation was where the piece truly showed its teeth. This section required a technique called artificial harmonics, where the violinist had to produce high, bell-like notes by touching the string lightly with one finger while pressing down with another. It was incredibly difficult to do cleanly and even harder to do quickly. Thomas had spent months just learning to produce these harmonics consistently, but now in this moment they sang out from his violin like small miracles. Each harmonic shimmered in the air, perfectly in tune, perfectly balanced. His grandfather had told him that harmonics were like trying to capture moonlight in a bottle. Possible, but only if your touch was exactly right. The blond boy who had sat next to him earlier was now standing in the doorway at the back of the hall. He was not the only one. Other young musicians who had already auditioned had gathered there, drawn by the sound. They stood silently, watching this impossible thing happening in front of them. Thomas moved into the fifth variation, and the music grew more intense. This section was all about power and precision combined. The notes came in huge leaps, jumping from the lowest strings to the highest in rapid succession. His bow arm drove the sound forward with increasing force, and the violin responded with a voice that seemed too big to come from such a battered instrument. Sweat was beginning to form on Thomas's forehead now. His fingers were starting to ache from the constant pressure against the strings. But he could not stop, would not stop. The music had taken hold of him completely, and all he could do was follow where it led. The sixth variation shifted again, introducing rapid triplets that required absolute evenness. 3 notes per beat, steady as a heartbeat while moving through complicated patterns. This was where his grandfather had spent the most time with him, making him play it slowly at first, then gradually building speed. Never sacrifice evenness for speed, Otto had warned him. Better to play it slowly and perfectly than quickly and sloppily. Thomas played it quickly and perfectly. The triplets rolled out like water over stones, each one exactly placed, exactly balanced. In the judging section, the maestro's eyes had narrowed slightly. He was leaning forward now, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The variations continued, each one more demanding than the last. Thomas poured everything he had into them. Every lesson his grandfather had taught him. Every hour of practice in the cold barn. Every moment of doubt that he had pushed through. Every time his fingers had cramped and his mother had massaged them until he could play again. Every sacrifice his family had made to give him this chance. The music swelled and soared. It whispered and roared. It told stories of struggle and triumph, of dreams lost and dreams found again. It was no longer just Paganini's composition. It was Thomas's story, his grandfather's story, the story of everyone who had ever dared to hope for something more than what they had been given. And then suddenly, he was approaching the final section. The last variation built toward a climactic ending, a cascade of notes that descended like a waterfall, before resolving in a series of powerful chords. This was it. The mom ant that would either seal his success or expose his limitations. Thomas gathered every bit of strength he had left. His bow arm, tired and aching, drove forward with renewed power. His left hand, cramping slightly now, pushed through the final runs with desperate precision. The notes came faster and faster, building in intensity, rushing toward the conclusion like a river racing toward the sea. And then, there it was, the final note. Thomas drew his bow across the string one last time, letting the sound ring out pure and clear into the vast space of the hall. He held it there, sustaining it until the very last bit of bow hair had passed over the string, until the note had given everything it had to give. Then silence, complete and total silence. Thomas lowered his violin slowly, his arm shaking from exhaustion. He opened his eyes fully for the first time since he had begun playing, suddenly aware again of where he was, of who was watching, of what he had just attempted. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Thomas stood there with his grandfather's violin hanging at his side, his chest heaving from the effort of what he had just done. His shirt was damp with sweat under his too small jacket. His fingers throbbed with a dull ache that he knew would turn into sharp pain once the adrenaline wore off. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The judges sat frozen at their table, staring at him like he was something they could not quite explain. The other young musicians crowded in the doorway stood equally still, their mouths slightly open. Even the woman with the clipboard had stopped writing, her pen hovering above the paper as if she had forgotten what she meant to record. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Had he done something wrong? Had he made some terrible mistake that he had not noticed? The silence felt heavy, oppressive, like something pressing down on his shoulders. He wanted to apologize, though he was not sure what he would be apologizing for. He wanted to run. He wanted to disappear. Then in the front row of the judging section, the maestro moved. Heinrich von Karajan, the legendary conductor who had led orchestras in every major concert hall in the world, who had worked with the greatest musicians of the century, slowly pushed himself to his feet. His chair scraped against the floor and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. The old man stood there for a moment, his silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers above. His face was still difficult to read, but something had changed in his expression. The skepticism was gone. The polite distance was gone. What remained was something Thomas had never expected to see directed at him: respect. The maestro raised his hands and brought them together. The sound of his clap echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Then another clap. And another. Slow and deliberate at first, each one a statement rather than mere appreciation. The other two judges immediately scrambled to their feet, as if woken from a trance. They began clapping too, and their applause was not polite or measured. It was genuine, urgent, the kind of applause that came from witnessing something unexpected and wonderful. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the room. The young musicians in the doorway burst into applause, some of them whistling and cheering. The woman with the clipboard was clapping so hard her papers fell from her lap and scattered across the floor. But she did not seem to notice or care. Other people began appearing from side doors, staff members and teachers who had heard the music from distant hallways and came to see what was happening. They joined the applause, filling the hall with sound. Thomas stood in the center of it all, completely overwhelmed. His eyes began to sting with tears that he tried desperately to hold back. He had not expected this, had not even let himself imagine this. In his wildest dreams, he had pictured polite acknowledgement, maybe a kind word or two. But this was something else entirely. Through the blur of his vision, he saw the maestro stepping down from the judging area. The old man moved with careful dignity, walking across the polished floor toward the center of the hall, toward Thomas. The applause continued around them, but it seemed to fade into background noise as the conductor approached. Thomas did not know what to do. Should he bow? Should he speak? His grandfather had never taught him the protocol for what to do when a living legend walked toward you after you played your heart out. Otto had taught him how to hold the violin, how to draw the bow, how to feel the music. But not this. The maestro stopped about 3 feet away from Thomas. Up close, he was taller than he had looked from a distance. His eyes were a sharp gray blue, the kind of eyes that seemed to see through surfaces to whatever lay beneath. Those eyes studied Thomas now, taking in every detail. The worn jacket, the 2 large shoes, the exhausted, tear-streaked face, the battered violin held in trembling hands. "Young man," the maestro said, and his voice cut through the applause clearly despite not being raised. The crowd began to quiet, sensing that something important was about to be said. That was extraordinary. Thomas tried to speak, but his throat had closed up. He managed only a small nod. The maestro's gaze shifted down to the violin Thomas was holding. His eyes narrowed slightly, examining the instrument with the careful attention of someone who understood such things deeply. He took in the scratches, the mismatched strings, the repairs held together with tape and hope. "May I?" the maestro asked, extending his hand toward the violin. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. This violin was all he had left of his grandfather. The thought of handing it to someone else, even someone as respected as the maestro, felt wrong somehow. But then he remembered Otto's words. "A violin is meant to be played, boy. It is meant to be shared. Do not keep it locked away out of fear." Thomas extended the violin carefully, and the maestro took it with both hands, the way one might receive something sacred. He turned it over slowly, examining every inch. His fingers traced the scratches on the wood, testing the tension of the strings, checking the condition of the bridge and the tuning pegs. The hall had gone quiet again, everyone watching this exchange with breathless attention. The maestro lifted the violin to eye level, looking down its length to check if the neck was straight. He plucked each string individually, listening to the tone. His face remained thoughtful, concentrated, giving away nothing of what he was thinking. Finally, he lowered the violin and looked at Thomas again. "This instrument," he said slowly, "has been through quite a journey." "It was my grandfather's, sir," Thomas said, finding his voice at last. It came out hoarse and quiet, but at least it came. He played it for many years. "Before the accident." "Tell me about your grandfather," the maestro said. It was not a request. It was a command from someone used to being obeyed. But it was also gentle, genuinely interested, so Thomas told him. Standing there in the center of the Vienna Conservatory's grand audition hall, holding nothing now that his violin had been taken, he told the story he had been carrying inside him for months. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam. He told the maestro about Otto Werner, who had been first violin in a regional orchestra. Not famous, not particularly well known outside of a small area of Austria, but talented and dedicated. Otto had loved music the way other men loved food or drink or sports. It was not just something he did. It was who he was. Thomas described the mining accident that had taken 3 fingers from his grandfather's left hand. The 3 fingers that were essential for playing the violin. The 3 fingers that held down the strings to create different notes. Without them, Otto's career had ended in an instant. Not gradually through age or declining skill, but suddenly, violently, completely. He put the violin away, Thomas said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. He hid it in the attic and tried to pretend it never existed. My grandmother said he never spoke about music again. Not for years. It hurt him too much. The maestro listened without interrupting, his face grave. Several people in the crowd had moved closer, forming a loose circle around them to hear the story better. The blond boy from earlier was there, all trace of his earlier superiority gone. He looked younger now, more vulnerable, as if Thomas's story had reminded him that life could be fragile and unfair. "When I was 6, Thomas continued, I found the violin in the attic. I did not know what it was at first. I knew it was a violin, but I did not know it was his. I brought it downstairs to show my mother, and she started crying. I thought I had done something wrong." He paused, remembering that day so clearly. The dust that had covered the violin case, the way it had felt to open it and see the instrument inside, mysterious and beautiful, the confusion he had felt when his mother's tears had come. "She took me to my grandfather," Thomas said. He was sitting in his chair by the window the way he always did in the afternoons. When he saw the violin, his whole face changed. He looked like he had seen a ghost. For a long time, he just stared at it. Then he looked at me and asked if I wanted to learn to play. The maestro shifted the violin slightly in his hands, his fingers gentle against its worn surface. "And you said yes." "I said yes," Thomas confirmed. I did not understand what I was saying yes to. I did not know about practice and discipline and all the hours it would take. I just knew that when my grandfather held that violin, even though he could not play it anymore, he looked happy for the first time I could remember. So I said yes. Thomas described the lessons in the barn, how Otto had rigged up old oil lamps to give them light in the evenings, how they would practice for 2 or 3 hours every night after his grandfather finished his shift at the mine. Otto would sit on an overturned bucket and guide Thomas through scales and exercises, demonstrating the fingering positions on an imaginary violin since he could no longer play a real one. He was patient with me, Thomas said, more patient than I probably deserved. Some nights I wanted to quit. My fingers would hurt, and I would make the same mistakes over and over, and I would get frustrated. But he never got angry. He would just smile and say, "Again, boy. Try it again." Each mistake teaches you something. The crowd around them had grown larger. More people had filtered in from other parts of the conservatory, drawn by rumors that something remarkable was happening in the audition hall. They stood quietly, respectfully, listening to this 12-year-old boy tell his story to one of the greatest musicians alive. 2 years ago, Thomas said, he played me a recording of Paganini's 24th Caprice. I had never heard anything like it before. It was the most beautiful and terrifying music I had ever experienced. When it ended, I told him I wanted to learn it. A small smile crossed the maestro's face. And what did he say? He laughed, Thomas said, and despite the seriousness of the moment, he smiled too at the memory. He laughed and told me I was crazy. He said that piece was for master violinists, not for young boys who had only been playing for 4 years. But I kept asking. Every day I asked. Finally, he agreed to teach me. He said it would take years and that I might never master it completely, but if I was willing to try, he was willing to teach. Thomas's voice grew softer now, and the crowd leaned in to hear. 3 months ago, he got sick. His heart, the doctor said. It happened fast. 1 week he was teaching me in the barn like always, and the next week he was in bed, too weak to get up. I brought the violin to his room and played for him every day. He would lie there with his eyes closed, conducting with his one good hand. Even when he could not speak anymore, he would move his hand in time with the music. Someone in the crowd sniffled. The woman with the clipboard was wiping her eyes openly now, not bothering to hide her tears. The night before he died, Thomas said, and now his own voice was thick with emotion. He made me promise something. He held my hand and made me promise that I would audition for the conservatory. He made me promise I would not hide my music the way he had hidden his. He said his biggest regret was giving up after the accident, and he did not want me to waste what I had been given. Thomas looked directly at the maestro now, meeting those sharp gray-blue eyes. At his funeral, my mother found an envelope in his coat pocket. He had already filled out the application to this audition. All it needed was to be sent, so we sent it. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not shocked or amazed. It was something deeper. Something that connected everyone in that room to the fundamental human experiences of loss and love, and the desperate hope that our lives might mean something beyond ourselves. The maestro stood there holding the violin, his expression unreadable. The great hall remained silent, waiting. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had just poured out his entire story to a room full of strangers, and now he felt exposed, vulnerable, like he had given away something precious that he could never get back. Finally, the maestro spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Your grandfather sounds like he was a remarkable man. He was, sir, Thomas said. His throat felt tight again. The maestro looked down at the violin once more, turning it gently in his hands. This instrument has seen so much. Your grandfather's dreams, his heartbreak, his hope, and now yours. He paused, running one finger along a particularly deep scratch on the wood. It has earned every mark, every scar. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Tell me, the maestro continued, his eyes lifting to meet Thomas's again. What do you want from music? Why are you here? The question caught Thomas off guard. He had expected many things from this audition. Judgment, criticism, maybe praise if he was lucky. But he had not expected to be asked about his deepest motivations by one of the most famous musicians in the world. He thought carefully before answering. My grandfather told me that music is a gift meant to be shared, Thomas said slowly. He said that keeping it to yourself is like keeping a candle in a closed box. It might be safe there, but it does not give light to anyone. He made me promise not to hide what I could do. Not because I am special, but because music itself is special. And if I can play even a little bit, I should share it. The maestro's expression softened slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. He taught you well. Not just how to play, but why to play. That is much rarer than you might think. He turned then, addressing the other judges who were still standing at their table. Gentlemen, I believe we have witnessed something extraordinary today. His voice was formal now, official. This young man has demonstrated not only exceptional technical ability, but also a depth of musicality that cannot be taught. It comes from somewhere deeper. The two other judges nodded eagerly, almost frantically. They clearly agreed but seemed hesitant to speak, deferring to the maestro's authority. The maestro turned back to the crowd that had gathered. How many of you have been studying music? He asked. Nearly every hand went up. And how many of you practice every day? The hands stayed up. And how many of you have access to fine instruments, experienced teachers, and excellent facilities? The hands remained raised, though a few looked uncertain now, sensing where this was going. This young man, the maestro said, gesturing toward Thomas with the violin still in his hand, had none of those advantages. He learned in a barn. He practiced on an instrument held together with tape. His teacher was a grandfather who could no longer play, guiding him with words and memory alone. And yet he just performed one of the most difficult pieces in the violin repertoire, with a level of artistry that many of you, despite all your advantages, may never achieve. The words were not cruel, but they were honest, brutally honest. Some of the young musicians looked down at their feet, uncomfortable. The blond boy who had sat next to Thomas earlier had gone red in the face, though whether from shame or anger or something else, Thomas could not tell. Do you know why? The maestro asked the crowd. Nobody answered. Because he had something that cannot be bought or taught in a classroom. He had love. Love for the music. Love for his grandfather. Love for the gift he had been given. That love came through in every note he played. The maestro turned back to Thomas. I have been conducting orchestras for over 50 years. I have heard thousands of auditions. Tens of thousands. Most are technically proficient. Many are quite good. But very few have what you have. Very few make me feel something. Thomas felt his eyes burning again. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. However, the maestro continued, and Thomas's heart sank at that word. There was always a however. Your instrument is in poor condition. The strings are old. The bow needs to be rehaired. And while you have clearly worked very hard, there are technical aspects of your playing that need refinement. You have developed some habits, not bad habits necessarily, but ones born from learning in isolation without regular correction. Thomas nodded. He had known this, had known that whatever he had learned in the barn with his grandfather would be incomplete. There was only so much Otto could teach him from memory and observation. This is why proper training exists, the maestro said, to take raw talent like yours and help it reach its full potential. He paused and something shifted in his expression. A decision made, which is why I'm going to make you an offer. The hall seemed to hold its breath again. Thomas's heart was racing so fast he felt dizzy. The Vienna Conservatory offers several scholarships each year to exceptional young musicians, the maestro said. These scholarships cover tuition, room and board, and provide a small stipend for living expenses. I am prepared to recommend you for one of these scholarships effective immediately. A gasp went through the crowd. The woman with the clipboard actually dropped her pen this time, and it clattered loudly on the floor. The two other judges looked shocked, then quickly nodded their agreement. Thomas could not speak, could not move. A full scholarship to the Vienna Conservatory. It was more than he had ever hoped for, more than he had let himself even dream about on the train ride to Vienna that morning. But the maestro was not finished. Additionally, he said, I will personally oversee your training during your time here. I cannot be here every day, of course. My conducting schedule does not allow it, but I will visit monthly to assess your progress and provide guidance. I will ensure you have access to the best teachers the conservatory has to offer. More gasps. This was unprecedented. Heinrich von Karajan did not personally mentor students. He was too busy, too important, too in demand around the world. Yet here he was, offering to do exactly that for a 12-year-old boy from a mining village. "There is one more thing," the maestro said, and he held up the violin. "This instrument needs to be properly restored. The wood needs treatment. The strings need to be replaced. The bow needs significant work. However, I do not believe in replacing things that have meaning. Your grandfather played this violin. He poured his soul into it. Then he gave it to you, and you have done the same. That history, that connection is worth preserving." He paused, looking at the violin with something like reverence. "I know a luthier here in Vienna. His name is Friedrich Klein, and he is the finest craftsman I have ever met. I would like to send this violin to him with instructions to restore it to the best possible condition while maintaining its essential character. Every scratch that can be saved will be saved. Every original piece that can be preserved will be preserved. When he is finished, it will play like a professional instrument while still being unmistakably your grandfather's violin." Thomas's vision blurred completely now. Tears ran down his cheeks, and he did not bother to wipe them away. The maestro was offering him everything. Not just an education, but a future. Not just replacing his violin, but honoring it. Honoring his grandfather. "And when the restoration is complete," the maestro continued, his voice taking on a formal tone, "I would like you to perform with it at a special concert. The Berlin Philharmonic has a Christmas gala every December. We invite young musicians to perform alongside the orchestra. It is a great honor and a significant opportunity. I would like you to be one of those musicians this year." The crowd erupted. Not just applause this time, but cheers. People were hugging each other, wiping their eyes, laughing with joy. The blond boy was clapping harder than anyone, all his earlier judgment forgotten. Even the stern-looking judges at the table were smiling broadly. Thomas stood frozen in the center of it all, unable to process what was happening. A scholarship. Personal mentorship from the maestro himself. Restoration of his grandfather's violin. A performance with the Berlin Philharmonic. It was too much. It was everything. The maestro stepped forward and gently placed the violin back in Thomas's hands. "Your grandfather would be very proud," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the noise around them. "I hope you know that." Thomas looked down at the violin, then back up at the maestro. "Sir, I do not know what to say. I do not know how to thank you." "Then do not thank me," the maestro said. "Thank me by working hard. Thank me by honoring the gift you have been given. Thank me by becoming the musician your grandfather believed you could be." "I will, sir," Thomas said. And it was a promise, a vow. "I swear I will." The maestro nodded, satisfied. Then he did something unexpected. He placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of respect and recognition. "You have already begun," he said. "What you played today was not the performance of a child hoping for approval. It was the performance of a true musician sharing something beautiful with the world. Do not lose that. No matter how much training you receive, no matter how many technical skills you acquire, never lose that essential quality of music played from the heart." "I will not." "Sir," Thomas said. The maestro smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Good. Now I believe there are some practical matters to attend to. You will need to speak with the administration about your scholarship. You will need to arrange housing. And someone should probably call your mother and tell her that her son just changed his life." At the mention of his mother, Thomas felt a new wave of emotion. She was back in Eisenberg, probably cleaning houses like she did every Thursday to earn extra money. She had no idea what had just happened. No idea that the boy she had sent to Vienna that morning on a prayer and borrowed train fare had just been offered everything they had ever hoped for and more. "Can I use a telephone, sir?" Thomas asked. "Of course," the maestro said. He gestured to one of the staff members standing nearby. "Please show young Thomas to a phone where he can make a call home. And someone find him something to eat. He looks like he might faint." It was true. Thomas suddenly realized he was shaking all over and his legs felt weak. He had not eaten since the sandwiches his mother packed that morning, and the adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was wearing off fast. As the staff member began to lead him away, Thomas turned back to look at the maestro one more time. The old conductor was already talking to the other judges, probably discussing the details of the scholarship and the training program. But he must have felt Thomas's gaze because he looked up and caught his eye. The maestro gave him a small nod. A nod that said, "You have earned this." A nod that said, "This is just the beginning." A nod that said, "I believe in you." Thomas nodded back, clutching his grandfather's violin close to his chest. Then he followed the staff member out of the grand hall, leaving behind the applause and the celebration, heading toward a phone where he would call his mother and tell her that dreams, even impossible ones, sometimes come true. The phone felt heavy in Thomas's hand as he dialed the number. His fingers were still trembling, though whether from exhaustion or emotion he could not tell. The staff member had led him to a small office away from the grand hall, giving him privacy for the call. Through the window he could see the streets of Vienna below, busy with people going about their ordinary Thursday afternoons. None of them knew that his entire world had just shifted on its axis. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Thomas's heart pounded with each ring. What would he say? How could he possibly explain what had just happened? Hello? His mother's voice came through the line, slightly breathless. She had probably run from the kitchen to answer. "Mama, it is me," Thomas said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Thomas, how did it go? Are you all right? You sound strange." "Mama, He stopped, overwhelmed. Where did he even begin? "Did they reject you?" "Oh, sweetheart, it is all right. We tried. Your grandfather would be proud that you tried." Her voice was already shifting into comfort mode, preparing to console him. "No, Mama. They did not reject me." A pause. "They did not?" "The maestro was there. Heinrich von Karajan. He heard me play." Thomas took a shaky breath. "Mama, he is giving me a full scholarship. Everything paid for. Tuition, housing, everything. And he is going to personally oversee my training." Silence on the other end. For a moment, Thomas thought the connection had been lost. "Mama, are you there?" He heard a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh or both. "Say that again slowly," so he did. He told her everything. The audition. The silence after he played. The applause. The maestro's offer. The scholarship. The restoration of grandfather's violin. The Christmas concert with the Berlin Philharmonic. His mother listened without interrupting, and he could hear her crying quietly on the other end of the line. "Otto would be so happy," she finally said, her voice thick with tears. He knew Thomas. Somehow he knew this would happen. That is why he filled out that application. "He believed in you even when we were afraid to hope." "I wish he could be here," Thomas said, and now he was crying too. "He is there," his mother said firmly. "Every note you played, he was there. Every moment of this, he is watching. I know it." They talked for a few more minutes, his mother asking practical questions about when he would start, where he would live, how often he could come home. Thomas answered as best he could, though many details were still unclear. Finally, his mother said she needed to go tell his father and siblings the news. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. "Thomas, remember who you are. Remember where you come from. This is a wonderful opportunity, but do not let it change the good parts of you. Stay humble, stay kind, and always remember that music is a gift, not a prize." "I will remember, Mama. I promise." After the call ended, Thomas sat in the quiet office for a long moment, letting everything sink in. His life had changed in the space of a single morning. When he had walked through the doors of the conservatory a few hours ago, he had been just another hopeful child with an impossible dream. Now he was a scholarship student with one of the greatest musicians in the world as his mentor. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The conservatory helped arrange his housing in a dormitory with other scholarship students. His family made the journey to Vienna to help him settle in, his father taking days off from the mine that he could barely afford. They brought his few belongings in a single battered suitcase and a cardboard box. Thomas's younger sister cried when they said goodbye, clinging to him until their mother gently pulled her away. His father, a man of few words, gripped his shoulder and said simply, "Make it count." Thomas knew what he meant. This opportunity had cost his family dearly, not in money but in sacrifice. Years of going without so Thomas could have violin strings, evenings spent quietly so he could practice, dreams deferred so his could come true. The first weeks at the conservatory were difficult. The other students were not unkind, but there was a distance. They came from different worlds. They talked about concerts they had attended, famous musicians they had met, summer programs in Paris and London. Thomas had nothing to contribute to these conversations. He had never been to a professional concert before his audition. He had never traveled outside his small region of Austria. The classes were challenging too. He was behind in music theory, sight reading, and many technical aspects. What he had learned with his grandfather was impressive but incomplete. There were gaps in his knowledge, holes that needed to be filled. Some of the teachers were patient with him. Others were less understanding, frustrated by having to explain concepts that the other students already knew. But Thomas worked harder than anyone. He practiced in the early mornings before classes. He practiced during lunch while others ate together in the cafeteria. He practiced late into the evenings until the dormitory supervisor had to tell him to stop so the other students could sleep. His fingers developed new calluses. His neck ached from holding the violin for hours. But he did not complain. He had made a promise to the maestro, to his grandfather, to himself. 6 weeks after his audition, Friedrich Klein, the luthier, called to say the violin was ready. Thomas made the trip to his workshop with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. What if the restoration had changed it too much? What if it no longer sounded like his grandfather's instrument? The workshop was small and cluttered, filled with the smell of wood shavings and varnish. Klein was an old man with steady hands and kind eyes. He brought out the violin carefully, and Thomas gasped. It was transformed. The wood glowed with new life, properly treated and polished. The scratches were still there, the ones that told its story, but they were now preserved rather than threatening to worsen. New strings gleamed in the light. The bow had been completely rehaired and balanced. Yet somehow, miraculously, it was still unmistakably his grandfather's violin. Its essence had been preserved even as it had been restored. "Play it," Klein said, offering it to Thomas. Thomas took the violin with reverent hands and brought it to his chin. He drew the bow across the strings, and the sound that emerged made him close his eyes. It was richer now, fuller, but it still carried the same warmth he remembered. It still felt like home. The weeks leading up to the Christmas concert were the most intense of Thomas's life. The maestro came to Vienna 3 times to work with him personally, spending hours refining his interpretation of the piece he would perform. Thomas had chosen one of Bach's solo sonatas, a piece his grandfather had loved. "You play with great emotion," the maestro told him during one session. "That is your gift. But emotion without control is chaos. We need to channel what you feel into precise, intentional choices. Every note must have purpose." Thomas listened and learned. The maestro did not just teach him about music. He taught him about discipline, about the marriage of feeling and technique, about the responsibility that came with talent. Finally, the night of the Christmas concert arrived. Thomas stood backstage at the Philharmonie in Berlin, wearing a suit that the conservatory had helped him purchase. It was his first real suit, and he kept tugging at the collar. Through the curtain, he could hear the orchestra warming up. The hall was filling with people. Hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. His mother and father were out there somewhere, seated in the audience. The conservatory had provided them with tickets, and his parents had made the journey despite the expense. Thomas knew what that meant. His father had missed more work. His mother had borrowed a dress from a neighbor. But they were there. When his turn came, Thomas walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, and he could not see the audience clearly, just a vast darkness beyond the stage. But he could feel them there, waiting. The restored violin felt solid in his hands, familiar and new all at once. He raised the bow and began to play. The first notes of Bach's sonata floated out into the great hall, and Thomas let everything else fall away. He was not in Berlin anymore. He was in the barn with his grandfather, playing as the sun set outside. He could almost hear Otto's voice guiding him. "Feel the music, boy. Let it speak through you." The piece unfolded exactly as they had practiced. Every phrase shaped with intention, every note placed with care. But underneath the precision and technique was the thing that made Thomas's playing special. It was love. Love for his grandfather, for the music, for the gift he had been given. When the final note faded, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the applause began. It started from somewhere in the upper levels and spread like a wave through the entire hall. Thomas bowed, his heart full. As he straightened, he caught sight of the maestro standing in the wings, watching him. The old conductor nodded once, a gesture of approval and respect. After the concert, Thomas's parents found him backstage. His mother hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe, and his father's eyes were suspiciously bright. "You did it," his mother whispered. "You kept your promise to him." Later that night, lying in his dormitory bed, Thomas held his grandfather's violin. His fingers traced the familiar scratches, the preserved marks of its journey. He thought about Otto, about the man who had lost everything but had given what remained to his grandson, the man who had turned his loss into a gift. Thomas understood now what his grandfather had been trying to teach him all along. Music was not about perfection. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about connection. It was about taking the beauty you found in the world and sharing it with others. It was about turning pain into something meaningful. It was about love made audible. He fell asleep with the violin beside him, and in his dreams he was back in the barn. His grandfather was there, whole and healthy, conducting with both hands as Thomas played. Otto was smiling, and in that smile was everything that mattered. Pride, yes, but more than that. Completion. The joy of seeing a dream fulfilled, not in the way originally imagined, but in a way that was perhaps even better, through someone else, through love passed down and transformed into something new. The next morning, Thomas woke to sunlight streaming through the dormitory window. He had classes to attend, pieces to practice, a future to build. But he was ready now, ready to honor the gift he had been given, ready to make music that mattered, ready to live a life that would make his grandfather proud. He picked up the violin and began to play.